Okay, got it. And we are also on Facebook Live um, for those of you interested in sharing that information with your friends. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the start of our 2024 Lunch and Learn series. We introduced this program during the pandemic as a way for people working for kids and families to stay in touch and connected to our statewide advocacy community. And this month, we're starting our third consecutive year, so yay us. My name is Terry Banis, and I'm Michigan's Children's Program Director. We're all very excited that you're here to learn more about the issue of the true cost of care and the child care system Michigan needs, a discussion that follows the release of the report by the same name, thanks to the Think Babies Michigan Coalition. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to add some context. Even before the Think Babies Coalition came on the scene in Michigan, advocates were making big strides in early childhood education, preschool, pre-K, and developing a blueprint for what high-quality childcare looks like in Michigan. Through the Early Childhood Investment Corporation and partners like Michigan's Children and others, Michigan developed a quality rating system for childcare and a program for working with providers in the various regions of our state to improve care and education for our youngest learners. Today's discussion builds on that and now dives into what we must do to pay for it so that it works well for our families, providers, and businesses, and strengthens the childcare system that Michigan needs. Inventing or investing in childcare is one of Michigan's top priorities, as anyone who has talked to Matt Gillard, our president and CEO, knows, and it's why many of you stakeholders are here. So let's begin. This program is being recorded and will be sent to you after today's meeting in your email. It's also running simultaneously on Facebook Live. Our guests are muted because it's a large group, but feel free to put questions in the chat and we will be monitoring those to use later on. I like to throw in a quote every once in a while, and as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done, and that's how I feel about this issue. Or in the words of a podcaster, we can do hard things. Slide 2. Stephen? Okay. We're very grateful to have 4 very accomplished professionals here today with important ties to the topic of true cost of care because of their unique roles as policy people working on this issue, researchers, and policymakers and opinion leaders. With us today is, left to right, is Catherine Ann Edwards, economic policy consultant, opinion writer for Bloomberg, and adjunct economist at Rand Corporation. She is a strong and consistent national voice on the childcare crisis we're facing as a nation, what's at stake, and what we should do. Brandy Jones Lawrence, senior analyst, Center for Study of Childcare Employment, Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, University of California. Her center identifies childcare as a priority issue across partisan lines, but asks, with widespread public support, why are governments underinvesting? You'll hear more about that. Sasha Klein, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy, the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, and the point person on Think Babies Michigan, working on the true cost of care study. And Amy Checkaway. Am I saying your name right, Amy? Great. Amy Checkaway, Senior Associate Commissioner, Massachusetts Department of Early Education and Care. Massachusetts made national headlines a couple of weeks ago as the latest state to adopt a new funding formula for boosting childcare assistance and support for providers. We'll start with a 3-minute opener from each individual to set the stage for a discussion, then led by Matt Gillard. So let's start with Catherine, followed by Brandy, then Sasha and Amy. Thank you all. Slide 3, Stephen. Catherine, welcome. And let's begin with you. It's awesome that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very happy to be here. My name is Catherine Ann Edwards, and I'm an economist, and I'm just here to give context not from the experience of looking for or providing childcare, but the economic realities of childcare as a service. There's really only one conclusion when you look at childcare in the United States, and that is that the private provision of childcare is a market failure. That's nothing to do with the people who work in childcare or need childcare, and everything to do with the fact that the math simply does not add up. Any parent, any provider can tell you that little children need the eyes, the hands, and the attention of a capable adult. And there is no kind of fix coming for childcare to suddenly make it cheaper to provide or more affordable to buy. There's no type of classic market solution on the horizon. There's no technology that's going to come and somehow make childcare easier to provide. There's no innovation or automation that could change the basic fundamentals of childcare. As it is, we have about 3 decades of evidence that childcare is not working in the private market because it is growing increasingly unaffordable for families. Over the past 30 years, childcare costs have increased more than housing, food, energy, medical care, and even prescription drugs. For the amount of airtime that those goods and services receive relative to childcare, which has increased more, gives you a sense of both how obvious this market failure is and yet how little we talk about it in those terms. Without any type of classic market solution coming to save it, this means that childcare is not going to suddenly right itself and become plentiful or affordable. It's only going to get worse in terms of who can afford childcare and who can sustainably provide it. And there's no other direction for it to go without public intervention and public dollars. The other thing that I'd like to highlight is that you know, what this means kind of in the immediate term is that only those individuals who are able to command market power through their income and resources are the ones that are able to access the highest quality care. There's been a lot of evidence and research that has looked at what are the best kind of 0 to 5 provisions of care, who provides them and how much they cost. And if you are not a family that benefits from access to things like a Head Start center for childcare, it is truly the richest that are able to afford the highest quality care. This means that we have this, deeply important public good and service, which is the education of the next generation of adults, in which the early years are absolutely informative and formative and so important to the future path they take, but it is becoming increasingly a privilege of the rich and wealthy to afford what most parents would like to provide for their kids. Many of you as providers have probably seen these struggles kind of on an individual level. You've faced, not being able to pay teachers and providers what you want, not being able to charge parents what you would like, not being able to provide the service that you want because of all these constraints. But they come from a market failure, which means that the only solution is a government regulation and government subsidy.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. Totally, totally important comments to make. We are certainly experiencing this given the clip that we just went through and are experiencing. Comment in the chat, wow, she nailed it. Great. Totally agree. All right, let's move on to, thank you, Catherine. Let's move on to Brandy. Brandy, welcome. Welcome to Michigan. I know you're not too far away. You're in the Midwest, but and you're probably experiencing similar weather to what we've got here: rain, snow, rain, ice, the whole gamut. But nice to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. And yes, you're absolutely right. And I seek sympathy from my colleagues at Berkeley who do reside in the Bay Area every time one of these events happen here in the Midwest. Hi, everybody. I'm Brandy Jones-Lawrence. I'm a senior analyst at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment at the University of Berkeley. I am here today to bring the perspective, as I'm sure you all can gather by the name of my organization, of the workforce in this crisis and this conversation about establishing a more equitable and foundational approach to supporting the earliest sort of years of our educational continuum, which is the early care and education sector. At the center, we act on the premise that the educators of very young children should be valued, respected, and guaranteed economic dignity, and that the provision of early care and education is indeed a public responsibility. Our work covers several areas of the child care workforce and is linked by our firm belief that research, policy, and activism are interconnected. We aim to reform this system through undertaking research, proposing policy solutions, and actively participating in change efforts that center and include teacher activism. Our vision is an effective public policy in early care and education, an effective public early care and education system that secures racial, gender, and economic justice for the women whose labor is the linchpin of stable, quality services. Our research staff frequently present and provide early care and education workforce data that cannot be found anywhere else, as well as provide expert commentary and technical assistance to local, state, and national policymakers and early care and education organizations. We release, just for a very small example, we release a national early care and education workforce index of all 50 states that relays trends in the workforce industry of early care and education about every 2 years. We are really one of the sole areas that focuses particularly on the data as it relates to the early care and education workforce. And as a result, we have been proud and honored to be a lead partner in the Administration for Children and Families National Technical Assistance Center on the early care and education workforce with a number of our colleagues who have been doing this work for numbers of years. We also host communities of practice nationally and locally, and we conduct state and local level workforce assessments and data analyses. So that's a little bit about the center and a little bit about where we ground our work. There's any number of you who have been in this field for a number of years who probably know our founding director emeritus, Ms. Dr. Marcy Whitebook, who basically has been a champion and a force for change for the early care and education workforce sector since the 60s, as a young mother herself, working on issues, putting her mind, effort, and expertise to issues related to what she was seeing in the early care and education workforce, the inequity, the sexism, and all the things that we know have sort of crafted the way that we address these early years of the educational continuum. So we'll get into a little bit more of that later, but thank you so much for having me and definitely for including the insights of the early care and education workforce on this very sort of important topic of what are we going to do with this system, this fragmented sort of market failure system that we just heard about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandy. Truly appreciate that introduction and to the organization that you work for and some of the topics that you've researched. We'll have more resources available on our website, including a document that you recently published on what lawmakers should be doing, which offers some interesting answers. I'm sure you'll talk about that in the panel. So next we have Sasha Klein from the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, and she is the Senior Policy Analyst for the ECIC and also is a point person on this very important policy issue with Think Babies Michigan. Thank you, Sasha. Thanks for being here. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. So as you heard, my name is Sasha Klein, and I work with the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, who provides staff facilitation for the Think Babies Michigan Coalition, which is a coalition of over 2,400 members in our state, parents, providers, advocates, leaders, state government officials, all of whom are committed to making Michigan a state where young children and their families thrive. And one of the things that the coalition invested in was to better understand this market failure that Catherine and Brandy just talked so eloquently about, which is certainly alive and well here in Michigan. And we commissioned a study called the True Cost of Care Study to better understand what this actually looks like here in our state. So in particular, we wanted to understand what was happening with our childcare market, chart a path forward toward a sustainable system that meets the needs of Michigan's families, and to the point that Brandy was making, also allows childcare staff to have the dignity of earning a living wage. So Think Babies Michigan decided to work with P5 fiscal strategies, prenatal to 5 fiscal strategies, and really kind of took our cue from several other states around the country who had already done this work. And we commissioned P5 fiscal strategies to conduct a comprehensive fiscal analysis of early childhood services, including childcare in our state, and to build a cost modeling system that would estimate the true or actual cost of childcare in Michigan on a per program, per child basis, accounting for different levels of quality, as well as different types of decisions about staff compensation. And the Michigan's True Cost of Care analysis also, importantly, quantifies the gap between current public investment in childcare and what it would actually cost to make childcare accessible and affordable for every young child in Michigan who needs it. So I'm happy to talk later a little bit more about the methodology that was used, but I wanted to just start with highlighting a couple of the key things we learned from the cost of care analysis that we did. Some things were, I would say, are things we learned, and some things were things that were confirmed by the cost study. So first of all, the study definitely confirmed that our childcare workforce in Michigan is woefully underpaid. So childcare staff in the state earn an average wage of $11 an hour. And very few of them are receiving retirement or health benefits. So that's without those benefits. That is barely above the minimum wage in our state. I recently looked up what the average hourly wage was of a fast food worker in Michigan, and it was substantially more than $11 an hour. So we have, in many cases, people who have dedicated their work life. Many of them have gone on to get specialized education and training to become competent early childhood professionals and be the brain builders for our youngest children, and they are not being adequately paid. Another thing that the study found was that our families are underserved. So current childcare subsidy rates are insufficient to cover provider costs, even at the most basic levels. So when we use the cost modeling and we don't include any increase in worker compensation, which is already inherently problematic, and we keep the quality of care at the basic just meets licensing standards, but nothing above and beyond that in terms of quality. Even in that scenario, the reimbursement that providers receive through childcare subsidies does not even begin to meet the actual costs of providing care. So for an example, the annual cost of care for an infant under that scenario is a little over $20,000 a year, which is almost $5,600 more than the annual subsidy rate for full-time care. So the bottom line is that providers who rely on subsidies, all right, and this is what we want providers who are willing to serve children who are low income, or families are low income who qualify for subsidies. Those providers who rely on subsidies are losing money with every child they serve. The gaps are much larger when you take into account paying your staff a living wage under that scenario, and a higher quality of care. So something akin to what in Michigan we would consider like a 5-star level of care. Under that scenario, it actually costs over $30,000 per infant and over $21,000 per 4-year-old, which is nearly twice as much as current subsidy rates. And I think the most important finding is that the annual statewide true cost of childcare in Michigan is 2/3 greater than our current public investment. So to adequately fund the system, it would cost roughly an additional $2.2 billion a year. And that may sound like a lot of money, but we know from recent research that was conducted by the Michigan Chamber of Commerce and partners that the state is losing more than that every year because of the childcare shortage. Parents are leaving the workforce in droves to care for their infants and preschool-age children due to the inability to find childcare providers that are affordable and meet their needs. The most recent data tells us that in Michigan, in a given year, 59,000 employees or workers have to leave their jobs because of childcare problems. I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. And now we're on to Amy. Terry, you're muted, I think, if you were trying to talk.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sasha. That was a very compelling description of what we're basically shooting ourselves in the foot. Thank you.
And just sorry, Terry, just quick before we jump on it, I did see a question in the question area about where people can get their hands on the study. Sasha, you just want to address that quick before we get into the panel?
Absolutely. So the study is publicly available if you go to thinkbabiesmi.org. There's both an executive summary and the full study. The full study includes the true cost of childcare in Michigan and the true cost of home visiting. And we're expecting that to be updated in the next month or two to also include the true cost of early intervention services in our state.
Thank you.
I will drop that email, that link in the chat right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry.
All right, Amy, please join us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this really amazing panel. I actually grew up in Michigan and my parents still live in the state, so it's meaningful to be here on multiple levels and sharing some of the Massachusetts story from where I sit within state government with all of you today. So I'm going to just provide some brief context and I hope I don't talk too fast and promise that I will say more now than I will say for the rest of the time. So happy to do rapid fire after this point, but I think without context, it's a little hard to just get the picture. So as quick background, I work at the Department of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts. This agency was established in 2005, and I believe we were the first state in the nation to create one agency to oversee early education and care and after-school services for families. The goal was and still is to really create a unified system of early education and care and align state resources to support families in a way that's responsive to their needs. My agency sits within the Education Secretariat under an Executive Office of Education, which is one of the executive offices under our governor. So that office is led by an education secretary who is really the governor's advisor on education. And our departments of elementary and secondary education, which primarily focuses on K-12 and higher education, are also separate agencies within the secretariat. There's a significant amount of important work that takes place across our education agencies and also a lot of important work, obviously, between our agency and secretariat and the other secretariats and agencies across state government. Each education agency, this is just a side note, probably for this audience, but has a board that sets policies and regulations related to early education and care. So my agency's focus is broad and of particular relevance to the focus of this panel today, in addition to many other things. A significant portion of The agency's budget is funding through the Federal Child Care Development Block Grant, which supports our child care financial assistance system for eligible families. So now to just fast forward, over the past 18 months, with support from the top down and sideways and outwards and everywhere, but with support from our governor and lieutenant governor, this administration, our legislature, our secretariat, the agency's board, external partners, advocates in our really diverse field of early education and care and after school programs, educators, staff, and many more. We've successfully moved forward some major reforms and improvements to our child care financial assistance system. There's much more to share than I have time for today on all of that, but very briefly, this includes revamping our child care financial assistance regulations, policies, procedures with a real focus on simplifying the application process for families, reducing paperwork, better supporting our most vulnerable families, and more. And all of these changes are to make it easier for families to access high quality care. And of even more relevance to the topic today, we've had incredible state investment over the past 2 years, as I think was mentioned at the beginning, from the Healy Driscoll administration and legislature that have really enabled us to put in place some transformative changes to both how much the state reimburses early education and care providers who accept child care financial assistance, or what we call our child care financial assistance rates, and also changes to our child care financial assistance rate structure itself. So this whole package of reforms, the last step of which was unanimously approved just a couple of weeks ago by the agency's board, and again, would not have been possible without support from everyone and everywhere, and the field as a whole, was both really highly complex and can also, I think, be described briefly in sort of 3 major buckets. So I have a happy story to share today, but there's been so much hard work that has happened over many years to get to this point, and I think that's really important to emphasize. What is happening? What happened that was in the news is that we were able to provide a meaningful increase to all of our child care financial assistance rates, so that providers can address increasing costs. We were able to make some major reforms to the agency's rate structure using cost research and modeling that we have spent a lot of time focusing on over the past 18 months in particular. So our rates can better reflect the cost of providing care rather than how much parents can pay for care, while still obviously attending to the local market for tuition. And then where resources remained, we also were able to raise some of our rates even further to try to meet the cost of care. We also almost simultaneously received approval from the federal government to move forward with what's called an alternative methodology, which is just really a cost-based approach to setting our child care financial assistance rates as part of our next state plan. And my understanding is we're currently one of 6 states that has been approved to do this moving forward. And all of this, again, I think reflects that one of the top priorities under this administration in Massachusetts is making childcare more affordable and accessible. So the reforms that we've been able to make so far increase affordability and equity for our most vulnerable families and our providers. And we're really proud of this work, as it will allow programs to invest more in educators and programming at the same time that we can help try to reduce some of the burden of the very expensive care that is offered all over the country, and certainly in Massachusetts. And so I think one of the questions was just, I think, like, what resonates based on what I've heard so far. And I just want to say, and then I'll stop, that again, I don't want to downplay how much work has happened, but in the end, I would say really simply that, you know, achieving buy-in in Massachusetts, and every state has its own unique context, really required collaboration, research, data, trust, and shared priorities and goals in terms of what we want for children, families, and our diverse field. And I think a shared commitment to what we want for the early education system as a whole, no matter where someone sits. So in closing, there's just been a lot of work over a very long amount of time to get us to where we are today, and happy to talk more about the cost modeling that we did, which is very similar to what Sasha was just talking about, and share the report, which is on our website, and sort of what the role of, from where I sit in state government, what role we played, and anything more that's of interest. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much. Listening to you talk is an opportunity to look into our future, so thank you. Matt, why don't you take it away, and we'll start the panel discussion for the second half of this hour. And if you'd like to begin maybe with Sasha's question or work that in, her question in the chat is, what would you say to a state that is hesitant to move from a market rate survey to a true cost of care rate determination methodology, because they're worried fewer families will be served? But here's Matt now taking the discussion forward. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you to all the panelists. This was great. I think we have the full spectrum of kind of addressing this issue holistically with all of your expertise today. So thank you for joining us, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. And yes, this will be made available. We'll have this on our website. This is being recorded, and we'd love for people to share this as widely and broadly as you seem appropriate. So yeah, I mean, Amy, I will start with you kind of with a question from Sasha, but even just kind of from some more context. I mean, Massachusetts, I think, really is kind of a blueprint for what, some of us would like to see happen here from Michigan, but you're not alone. I mean, in the past year alone, we've seen numerous other states make significant public investments, state dollar investments into their childcare system. And this is something that we just haven't been able to accomplish in a significant way yet here in Michigan. We saw Minnesota, I know in New Mexico, Maine, and many others. We're seeing, states really pick up where we're not seeing the continued investments or increased investments from the federal government for this issue now with the divided government in Washington, particularly states with Democratic legislatures and Democratic governors like we have here in Michigan. We're seeing pick up the ball and really move forward. So specifically to Sasha's question about, at least here in Michigan, we seem stuck on this market rate survey approach to addressing and setting rates. Do you have any advice to try to get over that hurdle, or to get to more buy-in or more acceptance of true cost of care modeling?
Yeah, I think that for decades, states have been sort of using market rates to inform childcare financial assistance rates. Again, that sort of comes from the federal government down. And I think there's sort of the short answer is there's increased recognition, I think, from the federal government and from a number of states that again, sort of basing investments or even decisions about sort of the rates or the reimbursement that's, the subsidies, whatever the term is, that's provided to help families access quality care. It's using the market rate as the only metric is sort of insufficient because again, it really sort of only reflects the market and sort of like the what families can pay and versus again what it actually costs to operate a program on the ground and provide again the kind of care and the kind of supports to educators and compensation, et cetera. And so I think that again, just speaking from where I sit, even over the sort of the recent past, there's been a lot of different conversations and discussions just about sort of understanding that. I think what all the other panelists were sort of speaking so eloquently about, just like understanding the broken market and sort of the role that sort of moving to a different approach, which is really being encouraged of states now by the federal government as well. So using using a different methodology, how that is a sort of a, again, a better tool to make sure that at least this part of the system is fully funded. So I'm not sure if sometimes,
No,
again,
that's helpful.
yeah, that would be my short answer.
All right, no, I appreciate that. And just to remind everybody tuning in, there is either in the chat or there's a Q&A section as well by the chat where you can drop in questions and we'll try to get to those. One quick side question to Amy, and then we'll move on to the other panelists with some thoughts on this. One of the things we've struggled with here in Michigan, especially with limited resources, is this kind of age-old question of eligibility versus rates. How did you address that, or how did that get addressed in Massachusetts? As far as we're always, debating or deciding whether we should push for increasing eligibility into our subsidy program versus increasing rates. And we've kind of settled on it needs to be a both and, but I'm just wondering how that played out in Massachusetts.
Yes, I think again, we're fortunate at the current time for it to be able to be a both and, recognizing that that's not always the case. But I think that both, again, even small additional investments to be able to improve reimbursement, again, for financial assistance, but also with a goal of serving and hopefully expanding the system to serve more families. So again, I think that tension, though, my understanding is one that every state faces at, just given uncertainty sometimes about the future, and to the extent that there can be sort of permanent investments and commitments made, that only helps. And I think we've had very fortunately, again, some significant state investment recently in Massachusetts. So when our federal relief funding ended, the state for the first time sort of chipped in to cover that amount and keep it going for this fiscal year. And I believe in our governor's budget, which will be released today, that commitment will continue for another year. And so again, that's a huge shift, also, and sort of a game changer in terms of having additional resources, which are really going into operational grants for programs to be able to stabilize programs, support the workforce, support additional compensation, improved quality, again, without transferring costs over to families. So both again, the child care financial assistance or subsidy rates complemented with that other funding stream, again, is something we've been talking about here, and feel very lucky to even be having that conversation.
Great. So Catherine, I'm interested for your perspective. I mean, I think you did a great job in your opening comments, kind of laying out the big picture, how this doesn't work from a market-based economic standpoint. It seems to me like this shift towards pushing government and the public entities to address and recognize the true cost of care is a movement in the right direction towards solving that market failure.
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of a there is a parallel. If you could design K through 12 public education today, would you provide it and have people attend for free, or would you give people a voucher? And you would probably, say, well, vouchers, that's this, it creates a market for education that's could be very skewed by certain things. And that's one way that I've explained it to people, like, why you wouldn't want to go with a system that was worse performing, if you could start fresh. The other aspect of this that I think is really hard to keep in mind is that a lot of these policies were overtaken by events. Like, we've inherited federal policies about childcare and subsidization that were constructed, 20, even 40 years ago, before the childcare market had deteriorated for that long. So it's possible when the demand for childcare was much lower and the cost of provision was lower, and you had less accessibility problems and only affordability problems, that this kind of market rate model made sense. That hasn't been true for decades. For decades, the problem has been there's simply not enough care provided and the cost has pushed up. And kind of the evidence of that is this just incredibly sustained increase in prices. So that that helps us understand the problem and also why so many of the current policies, while incredibly important to people who are benefiting from them, and they should not be made worse off, are very ill-fitting for kind of what the solution should be. Past is not always the best precedent.
Thank you. Brandy, how about from your perspective? I mean, particularly as we talk about the workforce, right? I mean, when we it seems like we've realized, I think, for quite a while here in Michigan, that unless and until we solve the workforce issues, we're not going to solve the underlying problem, not just around childcare, but around early childhood programs and supports in general, but particularly in childcare. But how does this effort towards a true cost of care help address the workforce issues?
Well, it fundamentally changes the whole way that we approach what Catherine was just mentioning, which is that when you have a cost-driven model instead of a what I can afford to pay as a parent model, then you can afford to put things like a living wage into the formula that you use to dictate reimbursement rates. And we haven't had that opportunity to do that except through this. We don't have that opportunity in the absence of a federal recognition, both money-wise and policy-wise, that early care and education is a public good. We don't have any other tool at hand right now than to use what we can, which is the alternative methodology process that exists within the subsidy system. But I'm going to say, first and foremost, we all know across our states that only touches the lives of children and families and educators who participate in the subsidy program. And there is a larger proportion of families and children and educators who work outside of the subsidy system because of all of the problems that exist and it creates. And so it's just one tool that we can use to impact a part of our sector. But when we look at the numbers, we are still only addressing some of the need and problem that exists in this country because we don't fundamentally recognize early care and education as a public good and treat it as such. We never have to argue about how much parents can afford third grade. We never have to worry about what the questions in the box about how can we encourage states who are reluctant to take on an alternative methodology because we're going to have to serve less families. We never have to worry about serving less families in K-12 education because guess what? It's funded and it operates like a public good. So when we have an alternative methodology process, it gives us the opportunity to build in the true costs of care, which includes an education workforce that is getting paid a living wage, and I would argue a wage that's on par with their K-12, at least K-3 counterparts. It is a new way of thinking about what we are doing, but it is a necessary way. And there was another question in the chat that I wanted to address just really quickly. It's related to the one that was mentioned about how do we balance this reluctantness to serve less families. We're going to serve less families whether we do this or not, because I can guarantee you no one is going to stay in this field, and we are going to have no one coming into this field when all we can promise them is poverty wages, poor working conditions. So we'll serve less families either way. Why not build a public policy schema that we can build on and move towards a policy construct that is more in line with what early care and education provision should be, which is a public good.
Yay, absolutely. So Sasha, let's talk a little bit more, maybe in more detail about kind of this effort here in Michigan and kind of what led us to embark on this and to recognize that pursuing this study, this true cost of care study in Michigan, how that's been received and kind of where we might go from here.
Sure. So I think we've had a very positive response to the study so far. And we are in the process of rolling out a communications campaign to make sure that we elevate it and get it in front of more people so we can talk about the results. I think the Think Babies Michigan Coalition, as we think about our advocacy and policy priorities, this study has deeply informed that. It gives us a vision for where we need to get. We recognize that it's not going to happen overnight, but we can foresee a future for this state. And we have sort of a 5-year kind of plan or pathway, thanks to the report, for how do we get to an adequately funded system that meets the needs of families and of businesses, and provides that living wage for our caregivers. In terms of opportunities and what we could do with the study, and where we're headed, we're moving into budget season. So we're waiting. We'll shortly get the governor's proposed budget. And the current administration has really invested in the expansion of universal preschool, which is wonderful. But we'd really like to see a vision that includes universal childcare, and a goal to move in that direction. When I talk to other states, those that have been able to kind of press these reforms forward, and been successful, they were able to sort of link childcare and preschool together as early care and education, and work with the government to build a strategy to expand it across the board, across all age groups, infants and toddlers, as well as preschool age children. Our agenda at Think Babies Michigan includes some strategies from this report, and that first and foremost is moving from the market rate methodology for setting childcare subsidy rates to a true cost of care methodology, for all the reasons that Brandy just so eloquently laid out. Our current situation, we've sort of relied on providers underpaying themselves, not paying adequate overtime, doing all these sort of amazing things that they have done to try to make the numbers work. But it's not sustainable. And we are seeing that already. We hear constantly at ECIC, we get calls from providers who are having to shut down classrooms or completely shutter their businesses, because they can't afford to stay open. They can't find and retain staff. Folks would rather be working at Costco or in fast food, where they can earn more money and have benefits. So that's one of the big messages that we need to get out there and in front of workers. And if it's okay, Matt, I just wanted to make a plug to everybody who's here for the webinar today. Since this is an issue that you clearly care about, we are having a Capital Action Day that we are co-sponsoring. Think Babies Michigan, the Prenatal to 3 BIPOC Alana Coalition, and the Michigan AEYC are co-sponsoring on March 20th, so that folks can get trained on issues and talk to their legislators about this issue in particular, as well as some others that affect the early childhood field. We welcome all of you to participate in that. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about the event, but that's March 20th. And if you go to the ECIC website within the week, there'll be a link so that folks can register.
Thank you, Sasha. And yeah, you'll be able to find lots of information about the event as well on Michigan's Children and through our networks as well. But it's great. We're excited about it and looking forward to it. So we've got a few minutes left here, and I'm going to certainly give the panelists each an opportunity to offer any other insights or comments before closing. But are there any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, Terry, that we want to address before we wrap this up?
Yes, thank you, Matt. There are a couple of questions. I put them down here. Simone has been, and this is really more of a statement, and we've talked about this pretty much, but Simone has expressed extreme frustration, as we all feel, with the fact that low-income families cannot afford childcare. And she asks if the tax credit, I think she means the subsidy, doesn't cover the cost of childcare, what are these families supposed to do? Sasha just mentioned that you can't rely on providers to work below the cost of providing that service. But can any of the folks on the panel address what you would say to a family earning a low income about the frustration over the affordability of childcare?
Can I ask a clarification question?
Sure.
Sure.
I'm trying to, so is it that, are we talking about families that have qualified for subsidy and then are getting charged by providers, sort of the family portion above and beyond the subsidy? Or are
That's
we
how I
talking
read the
about
question. Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's how I read the question, Sasha.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So one of the things that is an advocacy option and that many states have done is they have worked with, basically they've amended their CCDF plans to reduce or eliminate that percentage or that amount that families are getting charged above and beyond what the subsidy covers. And that's certainly something that we could look into doing here in Michigan as well.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Thank you. There's also a question about, do any of the studies that you've mentioned or are familiar with include the cost to each state to catch up children who do not have the benefit of high quality childcare and preschool? Now we know that these early years set people up for school success. But if they're not able to access that high quality care in the early years and then they go into school, I mean, is anybody looking at the cost down the road to not taking care of the issue early on?
We've certainly utilized that in the past here in Michigan, particularly when the governor even is utilizing that now in the push for universal pre-K and around kindergarten readiness and the cost to the state for having kids not ready for kindergarten. Now, we all as early childhood advocates know that being ready for kindergarten means more than just a 4-year-old pre-K program. It means access to high quality early care before 4-year-old as well. And I think that's one of the areas as advocates that we can really, step up and continue to point that out. And that, as Sasha pointed out earlier, what we're seeing in a lot of states, unfortunately, that we're not seeing yet in Michigan, is this recognition that what's needed is a more universal approach to care before kindergarten than just to focus on 4-year-old pre-K. In Michigan, we seem stuck on this prioritization or focusing around 4-year-old pre-K, at least from the administration, at least from the governor's team, in the legislature to some extent right now, and not as much focus or recognition of the importance of the child care sector as a whole beyond just 4-year-olds. And that's part of the challenge here.
Can I chime in?
Sure.
So, Anne, you have a fantastic question. I can tell you that it is technically very hard to estimate because really for two reasons. One, even with high quality universal early childhood education, it's not clear the gap would go away. So you're trying to find, what would be the difference between what it is now and what it could be relative to the cost in the future. So we don't have a way to necessarily be precise about that. And then the second problem is it's not clear that once you enter K through 12, everything that contributes to that gap goes away, right? We don't necessarily do right in early childhood education by not supporting childcare. We don't always nail K through 12 education either. And so it's kind of two parts of if in the very easy world, I estimate how much it costs to close the gap between 0 to 5 and estimate how much it costs to close the gap between K through 12. And then, I can just subtract those numbers and tell you it's a better investment. But in reality, neither are very straightforward because of all the other kind of forces that go on. However, looking at the long-term early childhood education has a lot of like much more kind of accessible calculations that do show why it's such a return on investment, and it doesn't use the readiness gap. So the readiness gap is one thing that we think would be improved by early childhood education. Hard to put a return on investment and ROI on it because the gap is very persistent and complicated. But things that do show almost like an immediate ROI, you help moms work and maintain their job and have stable, that's massive. You reduce out-of-pocket spending on care for families, and they immediately have like every outcome is like, okay, food insecurity goes down, housing quality goes up, right? There's those type of returns are almost instant because you're taking a massive cost burden away from families. And then in the long run, kids who have been in early childhood education versus not outperform kids who have been exposed to high quality early childhood education outperform similar kids, similar background kids who did not. So we have ways of calculating the ROI. I would love to do it through the readiness gap, but it's just not like fully tangible. That said, the District of Columbia is the only locality in the United States that offers 2 years universal pre-3 and pre-4. They have 2 years of early childhood education. The program rolled out a little over a decade ago, and those kids are starting to graduate. And so we are having a lot of evidence about the high quality early childhood education and closing readiness gaps. But it introduced in practice a separate problem, which is that at least in our nation's capital, white families pull their kids out of school, and they eventually opt out of the public school system, making it harder to follow the comparison group. So it is a fantastic question, but I wish we could come up with an answer, but there's lots of reasons why we can't.
And I would
Thank
just
you.
say this, I appreciate that, Catherine, and I would say this from an advocacy perspective. ROI used to be incredibly important, especially when we talked about getting conservative policymakers to support investments in this. It's less so now. What we have now, especially around childcare, is we've got the business community's attention. We've got the business community advocating for more investments in childcare because of their own self-interest, not because of ROI, not because it's better for kids. It's because they can't get employees to work at the jobs that they have.
Yep.
And so we have that conservative, and that lends itself to conservative support within policymakers and legislators. What we don't have is the prioritization amongst folks across the political spectrum. They all want to talk about childcare and they all want to talk about how they're supportive of it, but they're not prioritizing it and they're not putting their money where their mouth is. And so this starts with the governor and it runs through the legislature here in Michigan. We're seeing it in other states. We're seeing it in Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Mexico, Maine. I can name others where they are prioritizing investments, public investments into their childcare system. We're not seeing it here yet in Michigan. So it's not enough to let these people just talk about how they're supportive of it. We need as advocates to really push them on this as we head into this critical budget session that Sasha talked about. Thanks again. Any last comments quickly? I know we're over 1 o'clock now and I try hard to keep this under an hour because I know many people are on their lunch hour. Any last comments from any of the panelists here before we wrap this up? All right. Well, thanks again. I want to thank our wonderful panelists. This was a great discussion. Thank all of you for tuning in. Once again, as Terry said, this will be available on our website and it's available on Facebook and other places to find. Please share this and stay tuned for more. We'll be doing these monthly on other topics that we know are of interest to folks as well. So look for more of that on michiganschildren.org, and we'll share all the resources that were mentioned in this discussion as well through the chat and through email to those of you that have registered. All right. Thanks again. Bye, everybody. And let's go get them.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a good afternoon.